The First Amendment is the basis of American democracy. Every citizen theoretically has the right to express their opinion, but the Constitution is unclear on these rights when it comes to those under 18, especially in schools. Students nowadays have less First Amendment rights in schools than in other places, but they are still allowed to speak their voice as long as it's not disruptive to the learning environment. Any high school student can protest or fight for a cause if they aren't causing a disruption. But how are these rights decided upon? Throughout cultural, sociological, and political changes that Americans felt were necessary for their country, there was a strong change in the course of the Vietnam War and how the country perceived its successfulness. One main change in how Americans viewed the war and how they protested was the Supreme Court case Tinker v. Des Moines. How did this case impact the free speech rights of students and allow for the protesting coming from these teens?
In the 1960s, the Vietnam War was still going strong. However, many Americans were losing faith in the government and protesting the war as more and more citizens died in conflict. Protests had been common in the earlier years of the war, and now more than ever, the younger generations were the face of the anti-war movement. Soldiers were being drafted in extraordinarily high numbers, sometimes even reaching 40,000 a month. This prompted many mothers to join the anti-war movement because of the fear of losing their sons to what seemed like an increasingly unnecessary war. But the opposition to the fighting didn't start in older citizens. Many of the first protests emerged out of college campuses. More liberal students began to protest the war, including the students of the leftist organization Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. By the end of 1965, these students had begun to break through to a majority that still opposed the war.
College-age students weren't the only ones protesting. Discontent with the war had trickled down into high and middle schools, even reaching elementary schools. In December 1965, a group of students in Des Moines, Iowa, decided to protest the Vietnam War and support a Christmas truce suggested by Robert F. Kennedy. Mary Beth Tinker, John Tinker, Christopher Eckhart, and several others met in Eckhart's house and made a plan to wear black armbands to school. The Des Moines School District caught wind of this plan and put out a statement threatening suspension for students who carried it out. When the Tinkers and Eckhart wore their bands to school, the district carried out their promises, and the students were suspended. The students and their families opposed this decision, arguing that it was the students' rights under the First Amendment to wear the armbands to school. They carried the case all the way up to the Supreme Court, where the issue was decided upon in favor of the students in 1969. The idea that students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate came from Justice Abe Fortas after the ruling vote, essentially summing up what the case was fighting for.
This case had a huge impact on America culturally. It highlighted the anger the youth had against the war in its entirety. By the time the case was voted upon in 1969, there was an extreme distaste for the war in almost all aspects. The Tet Offensive had occurred several months earlier, reminding citizens that there seemed to be no end in sight. When the Supreme Court decided that students don't shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gates, it redefined what First Amendment rights meant to people. Students were now able to protest non-disruptively in schools. Previously to this case, there was no guarantee that students wouldn't be punished. As the anti-war movement coincided with the civil rights movement, there is even more importance to this case. The war caused citizens to strongly distrust their government for the first time in history, causing an eruption of cultural change. Tinker v. Des Moines opened the door for all Americans, no matter the age, to protest if they felt it was needed. Protesting a war had caused change in American culture that had rarely been seen on such a scale, and youth protesting like this had never been seen so extensively before either. Many adults had never seen this side of American culture before, and Supreme Court Judge Hugo Black went as far as to say, "I repeat that if the time has come when pupils of state-supported schools, kindergartens, grammar schools, or high schools can defy and flout orders of school officials to keep their minds on their own schoolwork, it is the beginning of a new revolutionary era of permissiveness in this country, fostered by the judiciary." This impact in culture was astonishing for adults, as seen in Judge Black's opinion. Many youth were already part of a changing culture that focused on peace and anti-war movements, as well as rising youth participation in the civil rights movement. Overall, Tinker v. Des Moines' cultural impact is far from little, as it gave First Amendment rights to school children and respected their ability to non-disruptively protest.
Tinker v. Des Moines had a tremendous political impact on America, paving the way for other Supreme Court decisions regarding students' rights. Tinker was the first time students were recognized as persons under the Constitution, and the first time they were guaranteed First Amendment rights. The case also established that while schools are places of limited free speech, students may not be censored based off the whims of their administrators. One of Tinker's lasting impacts is its influence over many other Supreme Court cases. For example, in the case Bethel v. Frazier, the Supreme Court placed limits on Tinker, asserting that students can be punished if they express themselves in a way that is obscene or disruptive to the learning environment. Morse v. Frederick solidified Bethel, expanding it to school-sponsored events and limiting expression that doesn't coincide with the school's message. Hazelwood v. Kuhlmeyer gave administrators the right to censor student journalism because it is school-sponsored. Rosenberger v. Virginia asserted that schools cannot censor students based solely on the viewpoint of their expressions. In addition, lower courts have ruled that administrators have nearly unlimited power to censor elementary, and to a lesser degree, middle schoolers. Tinker v. Des Moines opened the door for political activism for future students, as well as helped change political views on the Vietnam War and its political ramifications in the U.S. and worldwide.
Tinker also had a huge sociological impact on society, as the case itself was a response to the sociological effects of the Vietnam War. Students from middle school to college were angry at the government over the draft, especially since the draft was taking young men that were typically people of color. As their view of the military became more distrustful and anti-war, students staged protests against it. All the Tinkers agreed that they had no idea that their black armbands would lead to a Supreme Court ruling. Tinker v. Des Moines represented this push of youthful protest. Before Tinker, students under 18 didn't have legal protection if they protested at school, but many did so anyway, because the cause meant more to them than not being punished. The subsequent debate over free speech rights ignited a period of sociological change as people began to debate at what age a person can exercise full constitutional rights. Did First Amendment rights start as soon as a person was born, or did they start at 18? As a result of this debate, minors were finally considered persons under the Constitution. Tinker v. Des Moines was part of an era of social backlash against the U.S. government and brought student rights into the spotlight.
The long-term outcomes of Tinker are numerous. As the first case of its kind dealing with students' rights at school, it influenced many other later cases concerning the same topic. For the first time, students had real, legal protection of their freedom of expression. This protection ushered in an era of student activism that is still going on today. The Tinker case lets student protest without fear of extra punishment. For example, the National School Walkout against gun violence in March shows that the impact that Tinker v. Des Moines had on students. Based off this case, students are allowed to do this walkout without being disruptive. They can't get punished based off the protesting of gun violence, but students can get punished depending on their school's policy surrounding unexcused absences. There are also current debates over First Amendment rights of students now that social media and the internet is a way that many students express their opinions. This impact of social media on these rights has changed what students can say online. Schools have punished students for comments made online, even if the comments were made outside of school hours. Many advocates, including Mary Beth Tinker, are fighting for students to have similar rights online. Tinker states, the digital age, with its wonderful capacity to democratize speech, is so important to students' rights, but also carries new and interesting threats to students' rights. If we don't encourage young people to use their First Amendment rights, our society is deprived of their creativity, energy, and new ideas. This is a huge loss and also a human rights abuse. The long-term impacts of Tinker v. Des Moines are still being seen today, and will continue to change as society continues to adjust itself to new and improved technology.
In conclusion, this case changed America's perspective on what free speech is for students. Tinker v. Des Moines was a turning point in free speech. The First Amendment is one of the defining laws of America, and this case expanded its protections to citizens under the age of 18. For the first time, students could express themselves freely at school, no matter their beliefs or values. With the cementing of First Amendment rights of young people, there was a change in what teenagers felt they could achieve in society. Previously, students could protest if they wanted to, but they would most often be punished harshly by their school. As a result of the escalation of Tinker by the children and their parents, both awareness about youth protesting and actual legal change happened. Without the support of Tinker v. Des Moines, school children with an urge to protest would essentially be prohibited from protesting issues they felt strongly about.
Message for young people is that it's a good way of life to speak up, to stand up for a better world, and to use your rights to do that, to use your democratic rights, your First Amendment rights, the right to free speech, free press, freedom of religion, the freedom to assemble, the right to freedom to petition. You can use all of these rights to make a better world by knowing what's going on in the world and speaking up about it, and then doing something that young people are especially geared to, which is taking action.